The heavy glass door of the Midnight Crane diner didn't just open, it exhaled. When Isol stepped inside, the hum of the refrigerator seemed to drop an octave, and the few late-night patrons instinctively pulled their shoulders in, making themselves small. She was the daughter of the city's unspoken law, a woman whose name was a currency of fear. But she wasn't met with the usual frantic bowing. Instead, she was met with a silence that felt heavier than her own. Aloan didn't look up from the counter she was wiping. She didn't hurry. She didn't even blink. The rule was simple. You stop everything when a member of the Park family enters. Aloan broke it by simply continuing her work, her movements rhythmic and calm. When she finally looked up, her eyes didn't search Isol's for mercy. They searched them for an answer to a question Isol hadn't even asked yet. That was the first rule broken, the rule of invisibility. And in that quiet, drafty diner, the untouchable heiress realized that for the first time in her life, she was the one being hunted by a gaze she couldn't control. The city of Oakhaven was a place of strictly drawn lines. On one side, the towering glass monoliths owned by the Park family, a dynasty built on logistics that everyone knew better than to investigate. On the other, the weathered brick and fatting murals of the Hill District. Isol lived in the Heights, but her soul was trapped in the cold, sterile perfection of her father's expectations. She was the Ice Queen, the successor to a throne built on iron-fisted discipline. Aloan was a ghost in the Hill District. A woman of few words and deliberate actions, she worked the graveyard shift at a diner that had seen better days. She moved with a grace that suggested she had once been somewhere else, somewhere grander, yet she seemed perfectly content in the steam and grease of the Midnight Crane. The mystery began with a cup of tea. It wasn't on the menu. It wasn't something a diner in this part of town would even stock. Yet, when Isol sat down at the back booth, the one with the torn vinyl and the view of the alley, Aloan placed a steaming cup of Ugwanching Simwin infused tea in front of her. It was a specific, traditional Korean herbal blend Isol's grandmother used to make to soothe her nerves. Isol hadn't tasted it in 15 years. She hadn't told a soul she missed it. "I didn't order this," Isol had whispered, her voice like cracking ice. "You look like you needed it," Aloan replied, her voice a low, steady alto. In that moment, the power dynamic of Oakhaven shifted. The hunter became the observed. The daughter of the boss found herself returning night after night, not for the food, but to solve the enigma of the woman behind the counter. Aloan was a puzzle that money couldn't buy and threats couldn't solve. She broke the rules of engagement, the rules of class, and eventually the rules of Isol's own guarded heart. Hi there, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story is reaching. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new uploads. Now, let's dive into the story. The rain in Oakhaven never felt clean. It felt like a heavy, gray curtain trying to drown the secrets of the pavement. Isol watched the droplets race down the window of her armored sedan, her reflection staring back with a perfection that felt like a lie. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it ached, a sharp contrast to the chaos she felt brewing inside her father's boardroom. "The docks are secure, Miss Park," her driver, a man named Min, said without looking back. "Your father expects the report by morning." Isol didn't respond. She was tired of secure. She was tired of the reports that used business terminology to mask the scent of intimidation. "Stop here," she commanded, pointing to the glowing neon sign of the Midnight Crane. "Miss, this area is." "I know what this area is. Min, wait in the car." She stepped out, her designer heels clicking sharply on the cracked sidewalk. Inside, the diner smelled of old coffee and something sweet, like cinnamon and damp earth. Aloan was at the far end of the counter, polishing a silver spoon with a focus that bordered on the meditative. Isol took her usual seat. She waited for the rush. She waited for the manager to come scurrying out of the back, offering a free meal and 1,000 apologies for the state of the upholstery. It didn't happen. Aloan approached, her footsteps nearly silent. She didn't bring a menu. She didn't bring a glass of water. She simply stood there, her dark skin glowing under the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. She wore a simple black apron over a gray sweater, her hair twisted into a series of intricate, small knots. You're late tonight, Aloan said. Isol stiffened. I don't have a schedule you're privy to. The clock on the wall says 2:15. You're usually here by 1:45. The tea is oversteeped. Aloan reached out and took a cup from a shelf, a cup that wasn't the standard thick ceramic of the diner. It was delicate, bone-white porcelain, hidden behind the heavy mugs. She poured a dark, fragrant liquid into it and set it down. Why do you have that? Isol asked, her eyes fixed on the cup. It bore a faint, gold leaf pattern of a crane. It was part of a set that had belonged to the Park estate decades ago, a set that had vanished after the Great Transition when her father took over. Things have a way of finding where they belong, Aloan said, her voice devoid of any playfulness. It was a statement of fact. That cup belongs to my family, Isol said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Aloan leaned over the counter, her face inches from Isol's. She didn't smell like grease. She smelled like jasmine and old paper. Then why is it here, in a diner on 4th Street, serving a woman who doesn't even know how to ask for what she wants? Isol reached for her purse, intending to flash a badge or a stack of bills, anything to regain her footing. But her hand stopped. Under the edge of the counter, she saw a small, framed photograph tucked next to the register. It was old, sepia-toned. It showed a young black man with a saxophone and a young Korean woman standing in front of this very diner. The woman was wearing the same jade pendant Isol had on her neck right now. The breath caught in Isol's throat. Who is that? Aloan picked up a cloth and went back to the other end of the counter. Someone who knew how to keep a promise, unlike some. The bell above the door rang as a group of rowdy teenagers entered, but Isol didn't hear them. She was staring at the porcelain cup, the steam rising like a ghost between her and the woman who seemed to know the history of her own blood better than she did. For 3 days, Isol stayed away. She buried herself in the spreadsheets of the park group, trying to convince herself that the porcelain cup was a coincidence, a replica perhaps, but the jade pendant in the photo, that was unique. It was a twin dragon design, carved from a single stone. Her father had told her it was commissioned specifically for her mother. But her mother had died when she was 3, or so the story went. On the 4th night, the curiosity became a physical itch. She returned to the midnight crane at exactly 1:45 a.m. Aloan was waiting. On the counter sat the porcelain cup, but it was empty. A small sand timer sat next to it, the white grains slipping through the glass neck. 3 minutes, Aloan said, not looking up from a book she was reading. It was a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed. Isol sat down. Explain the photo. I don't owe you explanations, Isol. This isn't your office. You don't sign my checks. I could buy this entire block by noon tomorrow and have this building leveled by sunset, Isol snapped. It was the boss's daughter speaking, the mask she used to protect herself. Aloan finally looked up. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, stinging pity. It was the one emotion Isol couldn't handle. You could, Aloan agreed. And you'd still be sitting in the rubble, wondering why you're so lonely. The tea needs 3 minutes to reach the right temperature. If you pour it too soon, it's bitter. If you wait too long, it's medicinal. Patience is a rule you never learned, isn't it? Aloan picked up a heavy iron kettle and poured the water. The aroma hit Isol immediately, honeysuckle and toasted rice. My grandmother, Isol started, her voice trembling slightly. She used to say that about the bitterness. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She understood that some things are worth the wait, like the truth. Aloan pushed the journal slightly toward Isol, just enough for her to see a glimpse of the handwriting inside. It was Hangul, Korean script, but written with the flow and flourish of someone taught by a Western hand. Isol reached for the journal, but Aloan's hand clamped down on hers. Her grip wasn't violent, but it was as unyielding as stone. Not yet, Aloan whispered. You're still wearing your father's ring. Isol looked down at the heavy gold signet ring on her index finger. It was the symbol of her status in the park group. What does my ring have to do with anything? It's a weight, Aloan said. And as long as you wear it, you'll only see what he wants you to see. You want to know about the woman in the photo. You want to know why I have your family's porcelain, then come back tomorrow without the armor. Aloan pulled the journal back and tucked it under the counter. She then took the sand timer and flipped it. The 3 minutes are up. Drink your tea. Isol picked up the cup. The tea was perfect, exactly the temperature of a memory. But as she drank, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Aloan's wrist had a faint, faded tattoo. It was a series of numbers, but not the kind you'd see in a ledger. They looked like coordinates. "Why are you doing this?" Isol asked, her voice softer now, the mask beginning to crack. Aloan leaned against the back wall, watching the rain strike the glass. "Because a long time ago, a rule was broken to save a life, and I'm the only one left who remembers which life it was." Isol left the diner that night without a word. When she got into her car, Min asked, "Same time tomorrow, miss?" Isol looked at the gold ring on her finger. The light of the neon sign made it look like a shackle. "No," she said, "earlier." The park group headquarters was a tower of glass and cold ambition, a place where every footstep was muffled by thick, expensive rugs and every word was recorded by unseen ears. Isol sat in her office, the gold signet ring sitting on her mahogany desk like a discarded crown. Without it, her finger felt strangely light, almost vulnerable, as if the skin there was thinner than the rest. She had spent the morning reviewing the old files, the physical ledgers from the early 90s that had never been digitized. Her father, Park Jin-ho, claimed they were lost in a warehouse fire, but Isol knew her father better than that. He never destroyed anything that could be used as leverage. She had found the box in the deepest corner of the sub-basement, covered in a fine gray dust that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten sins. As she turned the yellowed pages, her eyes caught on a name, Elias Vance. The name meant nothing to her, yet it was written in the ledger every month for 5 years. Next to it were payments, significant sums marked simply as the Crane. Underneath those entries, in her father's sharp, aggressive handwriting, were the words, "Debt of Honor." Isol leaned back, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the Park family, honor was a word used to justify blood, not payments to a small-time diner in the Hill District. She pulled a magnifying glass from her drawer and peered at the signatures. There, at the bottom of a 1994 entry, was a witness signature. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and distinctly familiar. It was the same script she had seen in Aloan's journal at the diner. "Miss Park, your father is ready for the briefing." Isol jumped, nearly knocking the ledger off the desk. Her assistant, a young man who lived in a permanent state of nervous efficiency, stood at the door. "Tell him I'm reviewing the port logistics," Isol said, her voice regaining its icy edge. "I'll be up in 10 minutes. But she didn't go to the port files. She pulled out a sheet of tracing paper and carefully copied the signature of the witness. It wasn't a name, it was a symbol. A small, stylized crane with its wings folded inward. That night, the rain had turned into a thick, clinging fog that swallowed the streetlights. Isol walked into the midnight crane at 1:15 a.m., 30 minutes early. The diner was empty except for Aloan, who was standing at the far end of the counter, meticulously cleaning a fountain pen. "You're early," Aloan remarked, her voice cutting through the hum of the heater. "And you're not wearing the ring." Isol sat down and placed the tracing paper on the counter. "I found this, in my father's private records, 1994. Who is Elias Vance?" Aloan stopped cleaning the pen. She looked at the traced symbol, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of a leaky faucet in the kitchen. "Elias was a man who played the saxophone like he was breathing out his soul," Aloan finally said. "And he was the man who owned this diner when your father arrived in this country with nothing but a bruised ego and a suitcase full of someone else's money." "My father says he built the Park Group from nothing," Isol countered, though her voice lacked conviction. "No one builds anything from nothing, Isol. They build it on the backs of people who are too kind to say no." Aloan unscrewed the barrel of the fountain pen. "In 1994, your father was being hunted by the people he'd left behind in Seoul. He hid in the basement of this diner. Elias fed him. Elias kept the doors locked when the black sedans circled the block. And your mother." Aloan paused, her fingers tightening around the pen. My mother died in a car accident, Isol said, the rehearsed line falling automatically from her lips. Aloan laughed, a short, bitter sound. Is that what he told you? Your mother didn't die in a car. She died in this diner, holding a porcelain cup of tea because she knew it would be the last thing she ever tasted. The air in the diner suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Isol felt the world tilting. You're lying. My father loved her. He has a shrine to her in the house. He has a shrine to his own guilt, Aloan corrected. She reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy, ink-stained ledger of her own, one that looked identical to the one Isol had found in the sub-basement. She opened it to the very same date, October 14, 1994. In Aloan's ledger, there was a smudge of dried, dark red on the corner of the page. There was a rule in this neighborhood, Aloan whispered, leaning closer. You don't bring the war inside the sanctuary. Your father broke that rule. He used this diner as a shield, and your mother paid the price for his protection. Elias Vance took the blame to keep your father out of prison, so you wouldn't grow up with an orphan's brand. Isol looked at the ink-stained ledger, then at Aloan. The waitress wasn't just a stranger. She was the living evidence of a debt that could never be repaid. Why tell me this now? Isol asked, her voice cracking. Because the lease on this sanctuary expires at the end of the month, Aloan said, her eyes boring into Isol's. And your father's company is the one refused to renew it. He's finally trying to bury the last witness, Isol. He's trying to bury me. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Isol wanted to scream, to call Aloan a liar, to run back to the safety of her glass tower. But the bloodstain on the ledger was a silent, undeniable testimony. It matched the shade of the dark wood in her father's study, a color she had always found unsettling. Suddenly, the lights in the diner flickered and died. The neon open sign buzzed one last time before plunging the street into darkness. A citywide transformer had blown, leaving the Hill District in a heavy, velvet shadow. Don't move, Aloan's voice came through the dark, surprisingly steady. The floorboards near the kitchen are uneven. Isol felt a surge of panic. In the dark, she wasn't the heiress of the Park group. She was just a girl lost in a neighborhood that had every reason to hate her. She heard the strike of a match, and a small, flickering flame appeared. Aloan was lighting an old kerosene lamp. Sit, Aloan commanded. The fog is too thick for your driver to see the door anyway. They sat in the booth, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. For the first time, there was no tea, no service, no roles to play. Just two women sitting in the ruins of a secret. What was her name? Isol asked quietly. My father always just calls her Amma. I don't even know her given name. Suni, Aloan said, the name sounding like a prayer. Her name was Suni. She used to sit in this exact booth and draw. She said the light in this diner was the only honest thing in the city. And Elias? He was my father, Aloan revealed, the truth landing with the weight of a physical blow. He spent 10 years in a state penitentiary for a shooting he didn't commit, all because your father promised he would take care of me. He promised he would fund my education, keep the diner running, and ensure I was safe. And did he? Aloan gestured to the peeling wallpaper and the dim lamp. He paid just enough to keep me quiet, just enough to keep me tethered to this place, waiting for a protection that felt more like a prison. He didn't want me to succeed, Isol. He wanted me to stay right here, under his thumb, a reminder of what he could do to anyone who knew the truth. Isol looked at her hands. They were trembling. I grew up thinking I was lucky, thinking we were the good ones because we gave so much to charity, but it was all just blood money. It's not your fault, Aloan said, her voice softening for the first time. You were a child. You were as much a victim of his narrative as I was. He tamed you with luxury and he tamed me with poverty. Two sides of the same coin. I'm not tamed, Isol whispered, a spark of the old fire returning to her eyes. Then prove it, Aloan challenged. The silence in this room right now, it's the first honest thing you've experienced in years. Your father is coming for this land because he thinks he's finally erased the memory of Suni and Elias. He thinks he's the only one left with the map. Aloin reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished key. This doesn't open a door. It opens a box in the floorboards of the old jazz room basement. My father told me to give it to the one who comes looking with honest eyes. I thought he meant a lawyer. I never thought he meant the daughter of the man who broke him. Isol took the key. It was cold, made of heavy iron. If I take this, Isol said, I am declaring war on my father. He won't just take the diner. He'll take everything. He already took everything, Aloin reminded her. He took your mother's name. He took my father's life. What's left is just glass and paper. Is that what you want to be the queen of? The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a shared breath before a leap. Outside, the fog began to lift, and the distant sound of a siren broke the stillness. I'll be back tomorrow, Isol said, standing up. And Aloin, thank you for the tea. Aloin didn't answer. She just watched the flicker of the lamp, her face a mask of weary hope. The morning after the blackout, the park estate felt different to Isol. The marble floors, once polished to a mirror shine, now looked like frozen water, slippery and treacherous. She walked through the grand hallway, her eyes lingering on the portrait of her father that hung in the gallery. He looked regal, a titan of industry, but for the first time she saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped the arm of his chair as if he were afraid it might be snatched away. She retreated to her bedroom, locking the door, a rule she rarely broke, as her father demanded an open-door policy for his household. From her jewelry box, she pulled out a small, velvet-lined hidden compartment. Inside was the jade pendant Aloin had mentioned. Beside it, she placed the iron key. Suni, she whispered. The name felt strange on her tongue, a secret flavor she wasn't supposed to know. She spent the afternoon in the city archives, using her status to bypass the digital locks. She wasn't looking for property deeds this time. She was looking for personal effects. After 4 hours of searching through microfilm, she found a police report from 1994, filed the night of the incident at the Midnight Crane. It listed the items recovered from the scene. Most were mundane, broken glass, a saxophone reed, a bloodied apron. But at the bottom of the list, marked as returned to owner, was a silver locket with an engraved crane. Isol frowned. She had never seen a silver locket among her mother's things. Her father had always given her gold, platinum, and diamonds. Silver was common in his eyes. That night, she didn't wait for her driver. She took a nondescript taxi to the Hill District, wearing a hooded trench coat to mask her identity. When she entered the diner, the smell of jasmine was stronger than usual. Aloin was sitting in a booth, not working, but staring at a small silver object in her hand. Isol sat across from her without being asked. The police report said a locket was returned to the owner. My father never had it. You do. Aloin opened her hand. Resting in her palm was a delicate silver heart, tarnished by time but still elegant. She pressed a small catch, and the locket clicked open. Inside were 2 tiny photographs. On the left was a young woman Isol recognized as her mother, Suni. On the right was not Isol's father, but a man with deep, soulful eyes and a saxophone resting against his chest. Elias Vance. They weren't just business partners, were they? Isol's voice was a mere breath. In this city, in 1994, a man like my father and a woman like your mother weren't allowed to be anything at all, Aloin said. Your father didn't just kill a man's freedom, Isol. He killed a bridge between 2 worlds. He took Suni back by force, claiming it was for her protection. And when she died that night, he made sure the world believed she died a loyal park. Why did you keep it? Isol asked, reaching out to touch the cool metal. Because one day I knew you'd come looking. Not for the money, not for the power, but for the truth of why you feel like an outsider in your own home. Aloin closed the locket and handed it to Isol. The silver is tarnished because it's been hidden in the dark. It needs the light to shine again, just like you. The mystery of the locket was a cliffhanger of a different kind. It wasn't a threat of death, but the death of Isol's entire identity. Everything she believed about her parents' legendary romance was a fabrication designed to sanitize a kidnapping. My father is coming here tomorrow, Isol said suddenly, the realization hitting her. I saw his calendar. He's meeting with the demolition crew at 10:00 a.m. Aloan didn't flinch. Then I suppose it's time we find what's under the floorboards of the jazz room. The jazz room was a boarded-up basement lounge located directly beneath the diner. It had been sealed off for 30 years, officially labeled a structural hazard by the city, a designation Isol now realized her father had likely paid for. With the iron key clutched in her hand and a heavy flashlight in the other, Isol followed Aloan down a set of narrow, screaming wooden stairs behind the diner's kitchen. The air grew thick with the scent of dust, cedar, and something metallic. As the beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom, the jazz room revealed itself like a shipwreck on the ocean floor. Overturned tables, velvet chairs moth-eaten and gray, and a small stage where a single microphone stand still stood, tilted like a lonely sentinel. "My father used to play here every Friday," Aloan whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow space. "Your mother would sit in the corner, hidden by the shadows, and she would write letters she never intended to mail." Isol moved the light to the floor. "The floorboards, you said there was a box." They searched for an hour, crawling through the grit and cobwebs. It was Isol who found it, a section of the stage that sounded hollow when tapped. Using a heavy crowbar Aloan had brought, they pried up the wood. Beneath the stage sat a small, fireproof safe. It wasn't a park group safe. It was an old-fashioned model with a dial and a keyhole. Isol inserted the iron key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. Inside the box were 3 things. A stack of letters tied with a silk ribbon, a ledger titled The True Foundation, and a cassette tape labeled October 14, 1994. Isol reached for the letters, but her hand stopped when she heard a heavy thud from the diner above. The sound of boots, expensive, rhythmic, and terrifyingly familiar. "He's here," Aloan hissed, extinguishing the flashlight. They sat in the absolute darkness of the basement, listening to the muffled voice of Park, Jinho through the ceiling. "I don't care about the historical preservation," her father's voice boomed, stripped of the warmth he used with his daughter. "I want this structure leveled. If the girl is still inside, remove her. Gently if possible, otherwise do what is necessary." Isol felt a coldness settle in her marrow. "The girl!" He wasn't talking about Aloan. He was talking about her. Her father knew she was here. He knew she was digging. And for the first time, Isol realized that the protection of the Park family was only offered to those who stayed within the cage. "We can't go up," Isol whispered. "There's an old coal chute," Aloan replied. "It leads to the alley, but we have to leave the box." "No," Isol said, clutching the ledger to her chest. "This is the only thing that's real. We go out, and we go to the one place he can't touch us." "And where is that?" Isol looked at the letters in her hand, catching a glimpse of the return address on the top envelope. It was a law firm she recognized, one that had been dissolved years ago, but whose senior partner was now a Supreme Court justice known for his unwavering ethics. "We're going to see an old friend of Ilya's," Isol said. As they crawled through the narrow, soot-stained chute and tumbled into the wet gravel of the alley, Isol looked back at the diner. She saw her father's silhouette in the window, a predatory shadow against the neon light. The mystery of her life was no longer about what happened in the past. It was about whether she could survive the truth in the present. The achievement wasn't just escaping. It was the fact that for the first time in 25 years, Isol was breathing air that hadn't been filtered by her father's lies. The safe house was not a grand estate or a high-tech bunker. It was a small, dusty apartment above a tailor shop in the garment district, belonging to the retired clerk of the law firm Isol had recognized. As the heater rattled and hissed against the midnight chill, Isol and Aloan sat on the floor, the contents of the True Foundation box spread between them like the pieces of a shattered mirror. Isol opened the ledger first. This wasn't a record of debts or intimidation. It was a partnership agreement. It detailed a joint venture between Elias Vance and SUNY Park. They hadn't just been lovers, they had been visionaries. They were building a community land trust, a way to ensure that the Hill District could never be swallowed by the greed of developers like Isol's father. "Look at the dates," Aloan whispered, pointing to a column of figures. The payments your father made weren't hush money for a crime. They were the dividends from a partnership he stole. He didn't build the Park Group's real estate empire. He hijacked the one Suni and Elia's already started. Isol felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. Every luxury she had ever enjoyed, the private tutors, the silk dresses, the armored cars, had been funded by the systematic theft of a dead woman's dream and a living man's legacy. The protection her father provided the neighborhood was actually a slow-motion strangulation, using the very funds meant to uplift it. He didn't just kill them, Isol said, her voice hollow. He erased their purpose. He turned a bridge into a wall. She picked up the cassette tape. Her hands were shaking so violently that Aloan had to take it from her and slot it into an old Walkman they found on a shelf. They shared the earbuds, one each, leaning their heads together in the cramped room. The tape hissed with static, then the sound of a saxophone began to play, low, mournful, and achingly beautiful. Over the music, a woman's voice emerged. It was soft, with the rhythmic lilt of a soul accent softened by years in the American South. Jinho, if you are listening to this, it means you have found the safe. It also means you have failed to keep your promise. I know you think power is the only thing that keeps us safe, but Elias has shown me that trust is the only thing that keeps us human. We are leaving tonight. Do not follow us. If you do, the world will see the records of where your startup capital really came from. The recording was cut short by the sound of a heavy door slamming and a muffled shout. Then, silence. Isol pulled the earbud out, the quiet of the apartment suddenly deafening. The great transition, the fire at the warehouse. It wasn't an accident. It was the night he took me and killed the evidence of their escape. Aloan looked at her, her eyes reflecting the dim light of a street lamp outside. The mystery isn't why he did it, Isol. We know why. He's a man who fears being small. The mystery is why he's letting you live after you've seen the truth. Isol looked at the iron key in her hand. Because he thinks I'm still Tame. He thinks I'm just playing a game of rebellion before I return to the palace. He doesn't realize that I've already burned the bridge back. Then we need to move, Aloan said, standing up. He'll have the trackers on your phone and car pinned by now. We have 6 hours before the sun comes up and the demolition permits become active. We're not running, Isol said, her voice gaining a cold, sharp clarity. He thinks he's the only one with a map. He forgot that I grew up in his house. I know where he keeps the original deeds. And I know the one rule he never expected me to break. Which is? The rule of blood, Isol replied. He thinks I'll protect the family name at all costs. He doesn't realize I'm about to set it on fire to see by the light. They returned to the midnight crane under the cover of the pre-dawn fog. The building was already cordoned off with yellow tape, a notice of demolition plastered to the glass door like a death warrant. Isol watched from the shadows of the alley as 2 of her father's security detail paced the sidewalk. How are we going to get in? Aloan asked. We aren't, Isol said. I need you to go to the back entrance of the district court. Use the name Suni at the service entrance. There's a man there, an old bailiff named Mr. Henderson. He owed my mother his life. Tell him the crane has landed. And what about you? I have to talk to my father, Isol said. He needs to see the porcelain cup one last time. Aloan grabbed Isol's arm, her grip firm. He's not the man you think he is, Isol. If you walk into that diner while he's there, you might not walk out. I've spent 25 years not walking, Isol said, a sad smile touching her lips. It's time I tried. Isol stepped out of the shadows, shedding her coat. She walked toward the front door of the diner, her posture perfect, her expression the porcelain mask she had worn all her life. The security guards froze, then bowed deeply. Miss Park, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe. Open the door, she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from the throne. They hesitated, then unlocked the door. Inside, the diner was stripped of its soul. The tables were piled with boxes, and the smell of jasmine had been replaced by the scent of industrial cleaner. In the back booth, the one Aloan always kept for her, sat Park Jinho. He looked up, a smile spreading across his face that didn't reach his eyes. Isol, you've always had a flair for the dramatic. Come, sit, have some tea, though I'm afraid the service here has declined. On the table sat the crane-patterned porcelain cup, steaming. I found the letters, Father, Isol said, sitting across from him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her father's smile faltered. He took a slow sip of his own tea. Letters are just paper, Isol. They burn easily, like dreams, like old diners. They weren't just letters. They were a contract, a trust. You've been trespassing on this land for 30 years. You don't own the Midnight Crane. You never did. The deed was never in the park group name. It was held in a blind trust for the daughter of the crane. Jinho laughed, a dry, rattling sound. And who is that? You're a park. You're my daughter. No, Isol said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out the silver locket. She slid it across the table. I'm Suni's daughter, and according to the trust, the property cannot be demolished without the unanimous consent of the heirs, and I don't consent. Her father's face went pale. The mask of the great man began to crumble, revealing the terrified immigrant who had built a kingdom on a foundation of sand. You would destroy everything for a waitress, for a man who's been dead for decades. I'm not destroying everything, Isol said, standing up as the sound of sirens began to fill the street, not the sirens of the police, but the sound of the city's media vans and the legal couriers Aloan had summoned. I'm just breaking the rules you made, starting with the rule that says the truth has to stay silent. She walked toward the counter, reaching underneath to the spot where Aloan always kept her journal. There, tucked into the wood, was a final note Aloan had left for her. The achievement isn't in winning, Isol. It's in no longer needing to play. As the demolition crews were turned away by the court injunctions and the cameras began to flash outside the window, Isol realized the mystery was finally solved. The quiet waitress hadn't just broken the rules. She had given Isol the tools to rewrite them. The media storm outside the Midnight Crane was a kaleidoscope of flashing blue and white lights, but inside the diner, the air was unnervingly still. Isol's father sat motionless in the booth, the silver locket glinting between them like a fallen star. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, the sharp lines of his tailored suit suddenly appearing too large for a man who had built his life on a grand illusion. You think a few cameras and a dusty trust will stop me? Jinho whispered, his voice vibrating with a suppressed fury. I am this city's pulse, Isol. I have fed the politicians, I have paved the roads, and I have kept the peace. You are biting the hand that gave you every breath you've ever taken. You didn't give me breath, Father. You gave me a script, Isol replied, her voice gaining a resonant strength she had never felt before. And the hand that fed me was actually Aloan's family's hand. You just stole the plate. She walked past him, her heels clicking on the linoleum with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. She didn't head for the front door where the reporters were clamoring. Instead, she went back to the kitchen, toward the coordinates Aloan had mentioned earlier, a location hidden within the very layout of the park estate, which Isol had never fully understood. The coordinates Aloan had mentioned were 415211, 5N 873739, 1W. To the world, this was just a patch of wooded land on the far north edge of the park property. To the family, it was the Forbidden Grove, a place Isol had been told was structurally unsound due to old mining shafts. Aloan was already there, having slipped away from the court bailiff once the injunction was served. She stood at the edge of the iron fence, holding a rusted pair of bolt cutters. The maps in my grandmother's journal weren't for the city, Aloan said as Isol approached. They were for the heart of your father's lies. He didn't just hide the truth in ledgers. He buried it in the earth. They cut through the lock and stepped into the overgrown garden. It was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the main estate. Here, the trees grew wild, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. In the center of the grove stood a small, circular stone structure, a tea house that had been overgrown with ivy until it was nearly invisible. This was Suni's sanctuary, Aloan whispered. As they cleared the vines, they found a small, weathered headstone tucked behind the tea house. It didn't bear the park name. It simply said, Suni, a voice for the silent. But it wasn't just a grave. Beneath the headstone, nestled in a hollow of the stone base, was a small weatherproof container. Inside was the final piece of the mystery, a set of original land deeds that predated the park group's formation. These deeds didn't just cover the diner, they covered the entire hill district. They were going to give it all back, Isol realized, her eyes filling with tears as she read the signatures of Suni Park and Elias Vance. They were going to return the land to the families who had lived there for generations. My father didn't kill them to get rich. He killed them to prevent them from making everyone else rich. The achievement of this discovery was overwhelming. It wasn't just a business dispute anymore. It was the restoration of an entire community's future. The rules Isol had lived by, that the world was a predatory place where only the strong survived, were exposed as a lie manufactured to keep the rightful owners from their inheritance. The return to the main house was not a homecoming. It was an invasion. Isol marched through the front doors with Aloan at her side. The security guards, confused by the conflicting orders and the presence of a lowly waitress in the inner sanctum, stood frozen as Isol bypassed the biometric locks on her father's private study. "Isol, stop this madness," her father's voice echoed from the hallway. He had raced back from the diner, his composure completely shattered. Isol ignored him. She went straight to the heavy oak desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one he always kept locked with a key he wore around his neck. She didn't need his key. She had the iron key from the jazz room, and to her surprise, it fit the lock perfectly. Inside was a folder labeled Project Oblivion. "Is this what you called us?" Isol asked as her father burst into the room. "The people you erased, the history you burned." Jinho stopped, the sight of the folder making him look physically ill. "I did it for you, Isol, to give you a name that meant something, to make sure you never had to beg for a cup of tea or a place to sleep." "You made me a beggar of the truth," Isol countered. "You made me an accomplice to a 30-year crime." Aloan stepped forward, her presence in the room like a pillar of smoke. "My father died in a cell because he believed Suni's daughter would eventually see the light. He didn't hate you, Jinho. He pitied you. He said a man who has to kill love to keep power is already a ghost." The revelation of the Project Oblivion files was the ultimate cliffhanger. It contained the names of every official her father had bribed, every deed he had forged, and most importantly, the evidence that Elias Vance had been framed. The suspense wasn't in whether Isol would turn him in, it was in whether the Dynasty would survive the night. "The police are on their way," Isol said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Not because I called them, but because the court bailiff Aloan spoke to has already seen the ledgers from the safe." Her father sank into his chair, the Mafia boss reduced to a trembling old man. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades of lies. "What will you do?" he whispered. Isol looked at Aloan, then at the silver locket she still held in her hand. "I'm going to fulfill the contract, father. I'm going to finish what Suni and Elias started. The crane is finally going to fly." The achievement was clear. Isol had not tamed Aloan. Aloan had liberated Isol. The quiet waitress had broken the rules of silence, and in doing so, had dismantled a criminal empire without ever raising her voice. The morning sun didn't rise over Oakhaven so much as it struggled through a bruised, purple sky. Inside the park estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and the cold metallic tang of impending ruin. Isol stood in the center of the grand foyer, watching as a team of federal agents, men and women in windbreakers that looked far too casual for such a formal house, systematically tagged her father's collection of Goryeo-era celadon. Her father, Jinho, sat on a velvet settee, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't making calls to senators. He was simply watching the life he had built be dismantled by the very rules he thought he had mastered. Aloan stood by the tall, arched window, her silhouette a sharp contrast against the morning light. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, a weariness that went back 30 years, born of carrying a history no one wanted to believe. "They found the secondary accounts," Isol said, her voice echoing in the vast, empty space. She walked over to her father, holding a thick envelope. Everything you took from the Hill District. The diverted rents, the protection fees that were actually stolen dividends. It's all being frozen. Jinho looked up, his eyes glassy. You think you're doing something noble, Isol, but you're just handing the keys of the kingdom to the barbarians. This city needs a hand at the throat to keep it from screaming. No, father, Isol replied, her voice steady. This city just needed its own pulse back. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a check. It was a personal draft, the last of the funds she could legally access before her own accounts were scrutinized for the transition. It was for a staggering amount, the exact total of the back rent and interest owed to the Vance estate for the use of the Midnight Crane. She held it out to Aloan. It was the standard move for a park, a gesture of wealth to solve a problem of the soul. Aloan looked at the check, then at Isol. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Then, with a deliberate, slow motion, Aloan reached out and took the paper, and tore it into 4 neat pieces. The sound of the tearing paper was louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. Even the federal agents stopped for a second to look. What are you doing? Jinho hissed, a spark of his old arrogance returning. That's more money than you'd see in 10 lifetimes. I'm breaking the rule, Aloan said, her voice a calm, low hum. The rule that says everything has a price. You think you can buy your way out of the truth. You think you can turn my father's life into a transaction. Aloan walked toward the fireplace, where a small fire was crackling against the morning damp. She tossed the scraps of the check into the flames. They curled and blackened in seconds. I don't want your money, Isol, Aloan said, turning back. I want the name, I want the deed, and I want the chair at the table that was stolen from my father in 1994. You can keep the gold. It's too heavy for where we're going. Isol felt a strange, soaring lightness in her chest. She realized she had been trying to save Aloan with the tools of her father, not realizing that Aloan had already saved herself. The achievement wasn't in the wealth they could reclaim, but in the power to reject it. With the main house under federal lockdown, Isol and Aloan retreated to the one place the agents hadn't yet reached, the annex, a small, dusty building at the back of the property that had once served as the gardener's quarters. It was where the oldest records of the estate were kept, long before the park group had moved to its glass monolith downtown. The attic was a labyrinth of steamer trunks and moth-eaten curtains. Isol navigated the shadows with a flashlight, her heart pounding. She was looking for a specific box mentioned in her mother's final letter, a box marked with the number 77. Why here? Aloan asked, moving a stack of old frames. My mother used to say that if you want to hide a tree, you put it in a forest, Isol said. But if you want to hide a heart, you put it in the past. They found it behind a false wall in the chimney breast. It wasn't a box of documents. It was a single, large canvas wrapped in heavy, oil-stained burlap. When they unwrapped it, both women fell silent. It was a portrait, a masterpiece of light and shadow. It didn't show a businessman or a socialite. It showed a group of people sitting at a long wooden table in what was clearly the Midnight Crane. In the center was Elias Vance, his saxophone resting on the table. Beside him was Suni Park, her hand resting over his. And surrounding them were people of all races, laborers, musicians, mothers with children. But the most shocking part was the man standing behind them, his hand on Elia's shoulder. It was a young Park Jinho. He wasn't the monster Isol knew. He was smiling, a genuine, open smile of a man who belonged to a community. The painting was titled The True Foundation. They weren't enemies, Isol whispered, touching the painted face of her father. They were a family, all of them. He didn't just steal the business, Aloan realized, her voice trembling. He stole the memory of his own happiness. He thought that to be powerful, he had to kill the man who was loved. The painting was the final revelation of the mystery. It proved that the Mafia lifestyle, the untamable reputation, and the Cold War between the families were all a mask Jinho had donned to cover the grief of his own betrayal. He had spent 30 years trying to destroy the diner because it was the only place that remembered who he used to be. The cliffhanger wasn't a threat of violence, but a question of legacy. Now that they knew the truth, that the Parks and the Vances were meant to be one unit, the weight of the future shifted. "We can't just win a court case," Isol said, looking at Aloan. "We have to rebuild the table." Aloan nodded, her eyes fixed on the portrait. "The rules are officially gone, Isol. There's no more boss's daughter and no more waitress. There's just what we do next." The air in the annex attic was stagnant, thick with the particles of a history that had been smothered for 3 decades. Isol sat on a trunk, her eyes locked onto the portrait of the man her father used to be. The young Jinho in the painting didn't have the calloused heart of a man who moved pieces on a board. He had the eyes of a dreamer, the eyes of a brother. "He didn't just kill Elias," Isol whispered, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. "He killed the version of himself that was capable of being happy. He traded a seat at that table for a throne made of ice." Aloan knelt beside the canvas, tracing the brushstrokes on Suni's face. "The mystery wasn't just about what happened that night in 1994, Isol. It was about why the silence lasted so long. My father could have spoken up from prison. He could have told the truth to the guards, to the lawyers. But he didn't. He stayed silent because he was still protecting the man in this painting. He was waiting for Jinho to come back." "But he never did," Isol said. She stood up, the weight of her family name feeling like a physical burden, a crown that had grown too heavy to wear. "The crown I inherited is built on the lie that we are better than the people we serve. But looking at this, we weren't their masters, we were their partners." The external world was collapsing. Outside the annex, she could hear the muffled shouts of the federal agents as they discovered the hidden ledgers in the main house. The dynasty was officially over, but the internal weight was more crushing. Isol realized that her power had been a cage designed by a man who was terrified of his own shadow. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't call her lawyer. She called the press, the one reporter she knew her father hated most, a woman named Alara Vance, no relation to Aloan, but a seeker of truth nonetheless. "I have something you need to see," Isol said, her voice devoid of its usual frost. "Not a business statement, a confession." As she hung up, she looked at Aloan. "If I do this, there is no going back. The Park Group will be liquidated. The assets will be seized. I will have nothing left but my name, and even that will be tainted." Aloan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where the morning fog was finally burning off. "You'll have more than a name, Isol. You'll have the truth. And for the first time in your life, you won't have to look over your shoulder to see who's watching." The cliffhanger of the chapter wasn't a threat from her father. He was already defeated. The suspense lay in the radical choice Isol was making, to commit social and financial suicide to resurrect a ghost. She was choosing to break the final rule of her class, the rule of self-preservation. The Midnight Crane Diner was no longer a place of service. It was a sanctuary of memory. Despite the condemned signs and the yellow tape, Isol and Aloan returned one last time. The federal authorities, swayed by Isol's cooperation, had granted them 1 hour of supervised retrieval before the locks were permanently changed for the liquidation process. The lights were off, but the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes. Aloan went behind the counter. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't grab the register. She reached for the heavy iron kettle. "One last cup," Aloan said. "Not for the boss's daughter, for Suni's girl." Isol sat in the back booth. The vinyl was cool against her legs. She felt the silence of the room, a shared silence that no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a foundation. Aloan moved with the same deliberate, rhythmic grace she had shown the first night Isol walked in. She measured the tea leaves by touch, the scent of Ugwangcheng Simwen rising to meet the rafters. When the tea was ready, she didn't use the porcelain cup. She used 2 simple, mismatched ceramic mugs. "Why not the porcelain?" Isol asked. "Because the porcelain was a reminder of what was lost," Aloan replied, sitting across from her. "These mugs are for what we're going to build. They're chipped, they're plain, but they hold the heat just the same." As they drank, Aloan finally told the story of the night of the fire, not the version from the ledgers. but the version her father had whispered to her during his final days. "The fire wasn't meant to kill Suni," Aloan said, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her mug. "It was meant to destroy the deeds. Your father thought that if the papers were gone, the partnership would be forgotten. But Suni wouldn't leave the office. She was trying to save the letters. Elias ran in to get her, but the smoke, it was too much. Your father stood outside, watching the building burn, realizing that in his attempt to own everything, he was losing the only two people who actually knew him." Isol closed her eyes. She could see it, the orange glow of the flames, the betrayal, the moment her father's heart turned to stone. "He took me from the scene," Isol whispered, "and he took you to the foster system." "He didn't take me to foster care," Aloan corrected. "He paid a woman in the Hill District to keep me. He wanted me close enough to watch, but far enough to never be heard. I grew up in the shadow of your tower, Isol. I watched you get into those black cars every morning. I didn't hate you. I just wondered if you knew your tea was oversteeped." The revelation of Aloan's proximity, that she had been a silent guardian of the truth for 20 years, just waiting for Isol to be ready, was the ultimate broken rule. She hadn't been a victim, she had been a sentinel. The achievement of this hour was the final stripping away of their roles. In the dim light of a dying diner, they weren't the products of their father's sins. They were two women sharing a drink before a long walk. "The hour is up," a voice called from the door. An agent stood there, looking sympathetic but firm. Isol stood up. She didn't look back at the booth. She didn't look back at the counter. She walked to the door, paused, and looked at the agent. "The deed to this building is in my pocket," Isol said. "And the trust for the Hill District has been activated. You can change the locks on the house, but this land belongs to the people now." As they stepped onto the sidewalk, a crowd had gathered, the people of the Hill District, the ones who had lived under the park's shadow for decades. They weren't shouting. They were waiting. And as Aloan and Isol walked into the light, the crowd parted, not in fear, but in a silent, collective breath of relief. The finality of a kingdom's fall is rarely as loud as the history books suggest. For Isol, it didn't sound like a crash. It sounded like the soft, rhythmic clicking of a typewriter in a room that smelled of cedar and old hope. A month had passed since the federal agents had descended upon the park estate. The Ice Queen was no longer a title of power, but a ghost story told in the boardrooms of Oakhaven. Isol had walked away from the liquidation with nothing but the clothes she wore, her mother's silver locket, and the heavy iron key that had unlocked her life. The park group was a hollow shell, its assets being redistributed by a court-appointed trustee to the families her father had systematically displaced. Isol stood on the sidewalk of 4th Street. The midnight crane no longer bore the yellow tape of condemnation. Instead, the windows had been scrubbed clean, revealing the heart of the diner once more. Above the door, the neon sign had been repaired. It didn't just say open. It pulsed with a steady, warm amber light that seemed to anchor the entire block. She stepped inside. The bell chimed, a clear silver note that lacked the jagged edge of her first visit. Aloan was there, but she wasn't behind the counter. She was sitting at the back booth, the one where the mystery had first begun. Spread across the table were blueprints, not for a skyscraper or a luxury condo, but for the Suni and Elias Community Center, a project funded by the newly reclaimed land trust. "You're late," Aloan said without looking up. A faint smile played on her lips. "The bus was behind schedule," Isol replied, sliding into the booth. The words felt wonderful. She was no longer a woman for whom traffic was cleared. She was a woman who lived in the flow of the world. Aloan pushed a steaming mug toward her. It wasn't porcelain. It was a sturdy, blue-glazed ceramic cup. "I made it with toasted rice and barley today. Your grandmother's recipe, but with a twist of my father's favorite chicory. It's a bit rebellious." Isol took a sip. The flavor was complex, earthy, bittersweet, and deeply comforting. "It's perfect." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood wake up through the glass. Across the street, the construction crews weren't there to demolish. They were there to restore the old theater. The rules of Oakhaven had been fundamentally rewritten. The achievement wasn't just the destruction of a corrupt empire, but the quiet, painstaking construction of something that actually belonged to the people. I saw him today, Isol said softly, at the minimum security facility. Aloin paused, her pen hovering over the blueprints. And he asked for his ring, Isol said. He told me that without it, people wouldn't know who he was. I told him that was the point. That for the first time in 30 years, people might actually see the man from the painting instead of the ghost in the suit. Did he understand? I don't think he can, Isol admitted. He spent too long building walls to understand how to walk through a door, but he didn't scream, he just looked at his hands. They looked very small to me, Aloin, not like the hands of a giant. Aloin reached across the table, her hand covering Isol's. Her grip was warm, steady, and devoid of the tactical calculations that had once defined Isol's every interaction. The mystery is solved, Isol, but the story is just starting. We have 17 deeds to sign over this afternoon, and a board meeting for the trust at 7. And the rules for the meeting, Isol asked with a touch of wit. Rule 1, everyone speaks. Rule 2, no one wears a mask. Rule 3, the tea is never oversteeped. Isol laughed, a sound that was no longer rare but a natural part of her new vocabulary. She looked at the silver locket resting on the table. It was open, showing Suni and Elias, the two people who had started a revolution with a cup of tea and a shared dream. They were no longer secrets to be hidden, they were the foundation. As the diner began to fill with the morning rush, the jazz musicians from the club down the street, the nurses ending their shifts, the students looking for a place to study, Isol realized she was no longer an outsider looking in. She wasn't the hunter or the hunted. She was a partner. The Midnight Crane had become what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary. And as Isol took another sip of the rebellious tea, she knew that she hadn't just changed a name or a legacy. She had found a home that didn't need a gatekeeper. The mystery of Aloin and Isol ended not with a grand explosion, but with the clinking of ceramic mugs and the shared breath of two women who had finally, truly, untamed themselves.